it's segregation, and they really only interact with maybe a community of migrants who are also from their home country. And then integration, where they are allowed to maintain, or they're encouraged to maintain, the culture of their home country, but they also are still accepted by the members of their new country. So integration, which is when they can maintain their native culture while also integrating into their new society, is considered to be the most adaptive acculturation strategy. But xenophobia can make it difficult for immigrants to integrate.
This is what we're going to talk about, xenophobia. And I think everyone knows and has heard about xenophobia. Definition: prejudice, discrimination, dislike, or fear of people that were born in another country. And little problem here, but anyway, basically it's about in-group and out-group, and who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. And we know that many migrants are considered to be in the out-group. And why is it in the out-group? Is it because of competition? Is it because of fear? Is it because of concern about loss of power? There are a number of reasons in terms of out-group and in-group status.
Yeah, it was evolution. This is the part that you can't really see because the formatting is a little off, but it was evolutionarily advantageous for our ancestors to favor members of their own group over members of out-groups, because it made sense as far as competition to promote the success of their own group members. But it's not advantageous anymore as we're living in an increasingly globalized world. There's an increase in migrants of almost 50% since the turn of the century around the world. And so it's really not benefiting us anymore to value members of our own group over members of other groups. And so it's still triggered in us that instinct to feel fear or discrimination against out-group members, especially when we ourselves feel vulnerable, like it says on the slide, when we feel like we are losing social power, when we feel like there's a reversal. So that's why some argue we've seen a rise in xenophobia lately, as groups that have held power for a long time are starting to be on a more level ground with the groups that have been marginalized in history.
Okay, and this is just a little pyramid going from the most extreme, like violence, to discrimination, to prejudice, to microaggressions. And I'm going to talk a lot about microaggressions, but I mean, violence still occurs in terms of immigrants, but there are laws preventing violence against all people, but including immigrants. But occasionally there are incidents, even in New York, about violence against immigrants, and definitely discrimination. Again, there are many laws about protecting people and against discrimination in terms of employment and education, but still we know a lot of discrimination occurs. Prejudice, unfortunately we don't have laws, or maybe, I don't know, it's unfortunate or unfortunate, anyway, we don't have laws against prejudice, but it occurs a great deal. And certainly we don't have laws about microaggressions, which is something like I'm very concerned about, and something we're going to talk a little bit more about right now. Okay, we all know, everyone here knows what microaggressions are, right? You've heard the term? Has everyone heard the term? Or maybe not, okay. First, and they're brief, commonplace, daily. I bet each of us have heard a microaggression, maybe even in the course of today. It can be verbal, behavioral, or environmental. It can be intentional or unintentional. And it's often a communication is hostile or racist, negative, derogatory, and it can be, I mean, it can really cover the gamut, but I'm going to focus mainly, on microaggressions and having to do with ethnicity, because this is what I'm really concerned about with immigrants. Okay, and then there's, a lot of laws protecting us against physical attacks, but there's no laws about microaggression. And Sue, who wrote a lot about, he's a psychologist at Columbia, he wrote a lot about microaggressions. There's several books about it, and he has this expression, death by 1,000 cuts. In other words, no laws protect you, but it's like getting lots of little stab wounds. Okay. Now I'm going to show some pictures of microaggressions that occur in the workplace, but it also occurs in academia. Where did you learn to speak English? Where did you come from? What are you? Right? And also, we're just making certain generalizations about what you should be wearing. Are you even legal? Okay. How do you like this one? Were you born in Canada? Right? And, where are you really from? Now, how do we, deal with microaggressions? What about the melting pot? Now, when I was young, 1,000 years ago, it was a melting pot. This was the ideal. You were supposed to submerge your identity. We were all the same. This was considered healthy, right? And now there's still some people who really kind of cling to that people should really kind of give up their own culture. But the prevailing belief now is really in like a cultural mosaic that it really adds to us in terms of people with different ethnicities. Okay, now talk about some both psychological and physical reactions to microaggressions. Can lead to anxiety, depression, insomnia, loss of appetite, overeating, substance abuse, loss of confidence, feeling insecure, and you can see, and these are kind of workplace ones, but people who endure 1,000 cuts in terms of microaggression. And it's often something that people don't talk about. They feel almost uncomfortable talking about. And something that they do try to talk about is like, well, come on, you be real, don't be so sensitive. So anyway, my thought is, how do we really kind of deal with microaggressions? And because this is really related to xenophobia. I mean, this is one way we have of reacting to people who are different. Okay. Now we're going to go back. Okay, so what we decided to do today, begin with kind of the more personal and like what actually happens, a manifestation of xenophobia, and then kind of broaden it out to tell you more about like what we do more like at the UN, more like globally in terms of xenophobia. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through this step by step, but I just want to convey how complicated the UN is. I think when I first started, sometimes I have some students who say, "Oh, wonderful! I can't wait to sit on the Security Council." Well, this isn't quite what's going to happen. The UN is a very complicated structure, and there's the general. Maybe the first one. Go back. The General Assembly has 193 countries, and you may be very familiar. In September, they have a big meeting at the UN in New York. It's terrible traffic jams, But that's in all the countries and all their staffs are here in New York, and they make like important like policies in terms of our world. Then there's the last time, I went to the last time, Secretariat. It's the biggest bureaucracy in the world. If you think New York City government is complicated, or the U.S. government, you ain't seen nothing yet till you've seen the UN. And they have 38,000 employees, you know, all over the world. This is the biggest place, you know, here in New York City, but there are branches in other places around the world. Now, this is where we are. We're civil society. We're NGOs, non-government organization. And I'm involved with the International Federation of Social Workers, which is an NGO at the UN. There are some universities, as a matter of fact, Fordham University is also an NGO at the UN. I don't think that St. Francis is, maybe someday, but I mean, there are all kinds of NGOs. And there are a lot of grassroots NGOs really working with people, you know, on the ground. Okay, now I just wanted to show you all familiar with Sustainable Development Goal. This is what's driving the UN now. And hope by 2030 they'll realize some of these goals. And if you haven't read it or you're not familiar with it, I really encourage you to print it out and look at it and study it more, because I mean these are the goals for our world. I also want to mention the SDGs. You know, originally the Millennium Development Goal, it was for more developing world. This is for all of us. This applies as much to New York City as it does to like a little rural place in a country in Africa. This applies to us, and you can see, you know, things really make a difference here. Like good health is an issue here in New York City. It's not just an issue in a very poor country. But today we're going to focus primarily on the SDGs, which has to do with reducing inequalities, and that's really what xenophobia relates to. And I thought, since both psychologists and social workers should talk a little bit about how this is part of our code of ethics. And psychology, code of ethics is the principle respect for people's rights and dignity, right? And social work where we challenge social injustice. So this shows how our ethical codes really support our work. Okay. Now I'll talk a bit about. We've been involved with this subcommittee for years, and this is a project a student did several years ago. She did an infographic, which is, and I'm not going to kind of go through it bit by bit, but as a way, we publicized it widely as a way to talk to people about all these myths about immigrants. And this really relates to some of the issues we talked about today in terms of, with the keynote speaker. Are immigrants more likely to be criminals? It's really the opposite, right? And this is a myth that unfortunately, many people have. But this is something that they spoke about. The non-citizens only account for only about 5% of people in prison and people who commit crimes. But of course, there's big publicity, about those 5%. Okay. Yeah. The survey? Okay. Well, let me just talk a little bit about the survey. This is a big survey that the subcommittee took on, a monumental survey to look at NGOs all over the world, and there are thousands of them, all kinds of NGOs. Some of them are huge and have big structures and a lot of staff. Most of them are really very, very small and have very limited resources. But the subcommittee said, we're going to survey all of these and find out what, first thing, do you find the xenophobia in your lands? Because immigrants are everywhere, moving everywhere. And if you find it, how do you treat it? Or how do you work with xenophobia? So this is what we did. These are some of the other committees that, or these are some of the other places they distributed to all NGOs. They got hold of a number of email lists. It was a broad distribution. Well, we received 76 back. Now, which doesn't seem like a large number, but we're going to talk a bit about, why these were the only ones. But it's really very representative. There are 5 major, areas, and they're from all of the groups in 61 countries, so that's pretty representative. This shows you a little bit about where the NGOs, came from. All this shows you a little bit the clients that they work with come from. For example, an NGO could be, I'm working with an NGO, Close the Gap, which is based in Brussels, right, Belgium, but they work in Africa. So an NGO might be located in one place, but really work with clients and people in another country. Okay. This is a little bit about the populations that the NGOs served. You see the families, being kind of the largest population that the NGOs served. And and they looked at areas of intolerance and xenophobia. What areas? And then, as you can see, employment's very high. But also, and this really has to do with xenophobia, inclusion in the life of, the dominant culture. They're still kind of excluded. There may be laws, maybe about education, in employment, but to really be included is really challenging. Okay. And these are some of the barriers that they found to providing services. And of course, you can see the big one. Can you guess what the big one is, even if you can't read it? No money. NGOs function with very, very little money. Okay. We selected 8 NGOs, and you may ask, how were these 8 NGOs selected? And it was, they had to fill out a questionnaire, and some questionnaires were much more complete than others, and so that was one of the factors. Also, regional representation. We wanted to have NGOs from the different parts of the world, and also the different types of NGOs. There's all kinds of NGOs. There's some faith-based ones. There's some really into development. Others are really into education, and we wanted to have like a distribution from different places. Okay, this is just a list, and I'm not going to read through it, but you can see, like the different countries where the NGOs are based, and you can see the different types of NGOs. You can talk, and Abigail will talk about the problems with this.
Right. So as Dr. Congress mentioned, the survey was supposed to be distributed to quite a large list, quite a large pool, but we've only had 76 responses so far. Actually, I think since this presentation was written, we've had more responses come in because the survey will actually be ongoing. We're continuing to collect responses, so these are just preliminary findings, so that's one part of it. But we also think there might be issues with the survey itself because some of the questions require paragraphs of responses, and like Dr. Congress said, one of the big barriers that the NGOs surveyed faced was lack of funding. Another big area was lack of staff. So you imagine you're working at an NGO, you're already low on funding, staffing. You might not have time to fill out a long, pages-long survey. So that's one issue. there's also the possibility of inadequate dissemination. So an issue with emails is that emails can get lost. It's also hard sometimes to have a reliable email connection with less developed countries. And it's only offered in English. So this is obviously a huge barrier, especially when you're doing international work and work with immigrants. So, I mean, again, this goes back to the lack of resources on the part of our own NGO Committee on Migration. We just don't have the funding and staff to translate into multiple different languages, but that's definitely a goal going forward. So future directions. So with the survey, like I said, it's going to be ongoing. So right now we're working with Rutgers University, 2 departments in Rutgers. One is CIMIC, so they work with data distribution and analysis, and then UARRM, which is the University Alliance for At-Risk Migrants and Refugee Populations. So they are building a platform to host the survey on an ongoing basis, and they're also going to be analyzing the data for us. So this is great because, like I said, we don't have necessarily the staff to do such an ongoing data analysis and collection. And they're actually coming to a meeting on April 11th of the NGO Committee on Migration to talk more about it. So if any of you are interested in learning more about it, I'll be happy to give you that information about the meeting. And then,
by the way,
well,
I was just going to say, if anyone wants to contact I mean, my email is very simple, congress@fordham.edu. So if you want more information to go to this meeting or anything, please email us.
Yeah, and our emails will come up at the end of the presentation also. But we also need to code those qualitative answers. So going back to the limitation that some of the questions require long form answers. So we either need to figure out a way to code those or a way to ask the questions in such a way that it would be easier for them to answer and easy for us to analyze. And then another issue is that obviously it's extremely valuable to talk to service providers. They're on the front lines, but we also need to talk to migrants themselves about what the best practices are and what their needs really are and what will actually help and not just what we think will help. And we hear this a lot at the UN and within social work, and nothing about us without us. So I think it's extremely important, the whole committee thinks it's important to, moving forward, possibly develop some kind of survey to reach out to migrants themselves and ask them about this. And then also disseminating information. So earlier Dr. Congress showed you an infographic that a previous student made, so we want to work more on that. There was also a development of a compendium of good practices that was developed last year leading up to the negotiations to adopt the global compacts on migrants and refugees in Marrakesh in December. The whole United Nations General Assembly, well, not everyone, some countries didn't attend, but a lot of the General Assembly met to negotiate these compacts, which specifically outline the ideals going forward of how we want to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration, one of the compacts, and then the other compacts, how to promote the well-being of refugees. So leading up to that, we came up with 40 good practices, 10 of which are related to xenophobia and social inclusion. And those were, some of them were taken from the survey, some of them were taken from committee members' expertise. just knowledge of good programs that they knew about or good policies. And these practices and programs and policies that we presented at the negotiations in December are concrete ways to implement the ideals that are laid out in these global compacts. Because one of the complaints about the UN is that it's all well and good to talk about how things should be, but we also have to figure out how to make things that way. So that was the idea behind presenting those practices. So we want to continue to disseminate these good practices at the UN and among civil society, and also through social media. And then we're also working on connecting with the NYC Mayor's Office to connect these global initiatives with local initiatives and see what's going on in our own city.
So this is our journey, you know. So we're both global and local, and I mean it begins with us, you know, in terms of xenophobia. I mean, just in terms of the way we relate to others and the way we teach. I know there are educators in the room, where the way we educate our students and work with our students and working with others. But also, I mean, so it's done on an individual basis, but it's also done on a school and work basis, and it's done politically. I mean, New York City, fortunately, is really very committed and involved with this now. And so, you know, they're working with them on this issue, and also the UN is trying to work with us around the world. And we're going to continue with this study, and which is really interesting. It's one of the first times a study like this has been undertaken, and it's mammoth, as you can imagine. But it's important to think of, there is good work being done, like around the world, and sometimes we don't know about it. We just feel that we can learn so much about some of these best practices in terms of dealing with xenophobia. That's how to find us. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Or? Yes.
So in regards to microaggressions, which you mentioned in the presentation, is there any initiative or action being taken in regards to that in order to implement laws against those, against microaggressions? By any NGO organization, is there any initiative in regards to implement laws against microaggressions towards immigrants?
That's a good question. Everyone hear that? Are any NGOs really taking on the issue of microaggressions?
I think, because like Dr. Converse said, you really can't legislate against microaggressions. A lot of the time they aren't even intentional. I would say, I don't know specifically of NGOs that are working specifically with the mission to reduce microaggressions. It's possible, but I don't know of it. But I would say that, I mean, like most other things, I think a big part of addressing it is education, and I think that's a big part of a lot of NGOs' goals is to take away or break down these stigma or stereotypes that we hold about different groups. I don't know.
Definitely our professional associations, you know, like social work and psychology, is really kind of like, you know, against xenophobia and you know, kind of like against microaggressions and fighting for, you know, for social justice. But I mean, the whole issue is the law. There's not going to be a law passed, you know, against microaggression. There are some initiatives within schools. I mean, I know, you know, we've been working on it. I know maybe there's some work at St. Francis on it, and also sometimes in workplaces, but it's more like informal, if you will. I don't know, does anyone know? Or do you have another question about something else?
No, what I was gonna say is, in terms of microaggressions, because many people do not know how to identify that is happening. So I think the same way with the slide that you presented about assimilation, about integration, I think that when you come, myself one of them, you come as an immigrant, you don't understand any of those concepts and nobody educates you about, you should have the ability to maintain your culture while being, an important member of this new us country or whatever, but nobody is doing the education and outreach to the immigrants to talk about, to teach them about, assimilation, integration, multiculturalism, whatever. All those things, nobody's taking a word. And then at this level, we have the social workers, maybe one from Fordham as well. We talk about this, but nothing about us without us doesn't trickle down to the populations that we serve.
Yeah.
We're not having, workshops, going, to the communities in which immigrants live and teach them about all those things.
Right, yeah, and I mean, it's a really interesting point to me. First, a lot of microaggressions go almost, people don't speak about, people don't complain, complain about, they hear it, they're the victim of it, quote unquote, but there's no, they don't know what to do, what to say, and so that also perpetuates it.
For a lot of immigrants, they don't even understand. This for us, people that have lived here for a long time, old immigrants, we understood what's going on. So for a lot of these new immigrants, they don't even understand what's being said to them. Some of them is more obvious, but a lot of them is not obvious. I think it's just a general education problem. If the whole public have a certain attitude, we could change that attitude and make things better for everybody. That's something you can control.
Right, and you don't realize why, you feel like a little anxious or upset or put down. It's almost hard to identify it.
Identify it.
Yes?
I think that social media plays a huge role in this, in the sense that, yes, education is important, but being able to communicate to the masses is also important. And a lot of times, pre-social media, immigrants didn't have a way to really contact each other, or there was no information flow going on amongst them. Whereas now, social media allows for things like that. So I think if there is going to be an initiative taken to fight that, it would be through, some type of social media platform, possibly, that allows everybody to communicate fluidly. They can, but a lot of social movements now are done through social media and organizing through social media.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know if everyone heard, but she was saying that social media is really important as far as a way that immigrants can stay connected that they didn't have before, and a way that they can organize and come together and learn from each other. And that's really interesting that you bring that up, because actually in reading about the different strategies of acculturation, I think a big reason why assimilation was pushed so much and why it was sort of considered to be what people should do back before, people could stay so connected with their home country and people in their home country. But now that we have the internet and we have social media, people really are multicultural. So we're kind of having to figure out how to catch up to that, I guess.
Well, I think part of that is because the nature or the concept of what an immigrant is changing as the world gets smaller. So, social media did make the world smaller. It's not what it was before. So the meaning of immigrant is also changing along with that. So I think understanding that would allow, policies to adapt to that kind of immigration and issues that are being faced now.
Right, yeah, I mean, so, and I mean, we're all immigrants, you know, unless anyone in this room is an American Indian. I mean, we all are immigrants. And I think, and social media is doing a lot to, I mean, it's a great equalizer. Everyone has access to it. I mean, there were a lot of, you know, issues, you know, newspapers and all, like who had news, who read it, what was the news, right? And I can't see them involved in an anti microaggression campaign. You know, but it really helps, like in terms of educating people about it on social media. And they probably could put something on television, little things about, you know, it's interesting. I mean, you hear some things about discrimination, but not often at the level of microaggressions, right? So, I mean, it's interesting. Maybe there's some possibilities in terms of television.
I think the term microaggression doesn't say anything to anyone that doesn't know what it is.
Right. Exactly.
So you can use the term microaggression, but nobody understands what it means and how it manifests. And for that, you need education platforms. For the new generation, social media is the way that they live and breathe right now. And older generation, I still do traditional outreach because, believe it or not, a lot of the people that I serve do not have access to internet because they don't have the means to pay for it. So I cannot assume that everyone is going to have access to that platform, but I think we can do different things to accommodate the different families that we serve.
Yeah. So maybe a real approach we should try, you know, like in television, but also like in like social media more than. I mean, that's what was valuable about this and about the myths about immigrant, because they really tried to promote it widely on social media, and I mean, so. You know, so people could hear about some of these myths that were being promoted everywhere, you know, about immigrants. But maybe we need something that's specifically about microaggressions and really try to promote it widely on social media.
I think you're speaking also to a larger issue in academia where we make up terms for things and they are basically meaningless to anyone outside academia. That's a big issue.
Microaggression, should I even talk about it? Because I thought everyone in this room would be able to do that blindfolded. But I mean, maybe it's interesting how we know we speak our own language and feel everyone understands it.
And I mean, again, we're giving this whole presentation in English, and I know neither of us speak another language, and we're working with immigrant policy and population. So it's a huge issue, and I think you're so right that one of the best things to do is kind of empower the affected populations with knowledge about what's happening and what might be, I don't know, that they have the right, like you said, to maintain their own culture and also be a valued member of the new place that they've moved to. And so, yeah, I thank you for saying that.
Yes, Beck?
Given that like racial disparities, some of the worst impacts of them are in lack of access to housing and education and healthcare. I was wondering if the National Association of Social Workers had done anything to try to get the United States to sign or ratify the Convention on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights.
Well, that's a hard one because the United States, maybe because they're so legalistic, they're really afraid of signing on to this, and they're very important that they haven't signed on to it about children, right? When all the countries in the world have. And I mean, NASW, National Association, I mean, we're very involved with advocacy work, and and our main office is in Washington, D.C., and there's a special advocacy unit, and they talk to legislators and all, but I mean, not to be discouraged because nothing's impossible, but it's it's uphill. But that's something we're like trying to work on at a national level.
Yeah, and like Dr. Congress was saying, we haven't signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we also voted no to both the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. And for the Global Compact on Refugees, we were one of 5 countries in the whole world, 193 in the General Assembly that voted no. Or actually, 3 abstained. We were one of 2 who voted no. So yeah, I mean, and I think you're right, we should not give up and we should continue fighting for the US to sign on, but it is challenging.
Could you put up the slide again that showed the areas of tolerance? You had inclusion, life, bounty. Okay, that's it.
Of this one?
Was that one? All right.
Or the one earlier? About integration? Is that the one you want?
No, that one.
That one? Okay. Do you have a particular question or?
No, I just wanted to see the.
Yeah, I'm just curious what your goals, what you were hoping would come out of the survey. 1, 2, being at the UN, you have access to a gazillion interpreters. I don't know how much they charge you to maybe at least do French and Spanish, Chinese and Arabic, at least if you got those languages covered. And then 3, I mean, what's your funding source? Because, I mean, this is like a dissertation topic for somebody easily. And there's a computer program, which I've forgotten the name of, that counts words and patterns. And it's like SPSS, which is statistical, which is numbers, but does the same thing for words. A lot of PsyD people use that qualitative studies. So I'm blanking on the word, and I have no Wi-Fi here, so I can't find it.
Yeah, it's I mean, as far as the translating part, the UN does have great access to translators, but that's also part of the divide between UN and civil society.
We're completely volunteer. I mean, no way.
Yeah, we're volunteers.
But something that in fact, I said, I was a little surprised that they hadn't been translated into French and Spanish, because that seems fairly easy to do, and they're members of the our NGO committees who are, French and French speaking and also Spanish speaking, but it just seemed, like very, very involved. But going forth, I think at least it has to be translated into French and Spanish, because that really affected the turnaround too. A lot of people did, they didn't understand the language. I mean, that was it.
How long is this survey?
Well, that's another.
It's not that many questions.
Every single question that we were debating about that.
It's not that many questions, but there are 3 or 4 that really would require at least a page of writing. So I don't know if you're asking about how long it is as far as how difficult it would be to translate, or how, okay. Yeah, I don't think it would take that long to translate, because the questions themselves aren't super complex or numerous, but I think the length of responses required is still an issue for sure.
People are the few volunteers that NGOs, committees, or organizations have on the ground are so like small staff. There's almost like no staff, and they're so involved in providing direct services to people, to clients. They don't have time to fill out even a short questionnaire. So I mean, I think that's something that also helps with
travel around.
Pardon?
Pay someone to travel for work.
Well, if you want to find me something, you have some funds. Yeah, that's it. That's why the study is going to be ongoing. It's going to be resolved, or not resolved, refined, shall we say, into and we'll try again. Yes, someone.
I don't know if I just said what exactly is the survey measuring? Like, is it measuring microaggressions?
No, it's really best practices in terms of dealing with xenophobia. And microaggressions is kind of like one sign of xenophobia. And that's why we talk about microaggressions, because I think it really makes it, close and personal, something that we know and can relate to. But the study itself was about looking at xenophobia, around the world, and what agencies have done around the world to try to deal with xenophobia. I'm sorry. This is very, I'm doing a little hand tap here.
I think one potential problem with the term microaggression is that it doesn't deal sufficiently with what's in the mind of the person who considers this could be a microaggression or not. If you make a joke, let's say, the context of the situation in which the joke occurs can be so important, but you may, if you're thin-skinned, you think one way about this. If you're more thick-skinned, you think that's a joke, or you're ambivalent or whatever, right? Or if somebody asks you, where are you really from? That could be all sorts of things. Sometimes it might be hostile. Sometimes it might be just sort of not very sensitive to the context, and so on and so on. Right? So I think the term microaggression, even though it is in one sense an obvious occurrence that occurs every day in many people's lives, right? In spite of that, is also there's an ambiguity in the term, and you can't get rid of it. I have talked to, I interview Chinese origin persons, right? Sometimes don't ask them about microaggressions, right? But tell me a situation where you felt, there wasn't a very good situation involving a non-Chinese origin person. And they will often tell you, I don't know exactly what that meant. And sometimes they internalize it, which is unfortunate. Right? Sometimes they externalize it, which means they get hostile or whatever. And sometimes, very often, they sort of just say nothing because they don't really know exactly what the hell is going on in that situation. Excuse my language. And I think even though the term is widely used, I don't think people have paid enough attention to that point. That it isn't simply what happened, but also what the two parties involved.
Dr. Phelan, you make a very important, very interesting point. Microaggression, perhaps it's almost too grand a term. It means different things, both in terms of the way that it's interpreted by the person, by the subject of this microaggression. I mean, is it really nothing, or is it really a big issue? Is it like the Chinese people, students that you interviewed? Many of them weren't even aware of it. It didn't, it just didn't enter their consciousness. But also, just in terms of the person saying it, and I think about myself, I'm a social worker, psychologist, but I talk about xenophobia. I'm the last person wanting to be accused of a microaggression, but sometimes I find when I've met someone from who, I think, I identify somehow as an immigrant. My first question, well, where are you from? And what did you just ask? Anyway, I think it's really important. I mean, there's a lot of different motivations that, for a person who commits a microaggression. And also just in terms of deciding what is a microaggression and what makes it a microaggression.
Yeah, I just going off of that, I feel like microaggressions are almost never intentionally aggressive, but maybe the person experiencing the microaggression might not even consciously register it. But I think it's all about, like you said, death by 1,000 cuts. It's these little tiny things that all are just tiny, constant reminders that you don't belong, or you're different, or not that you're different, but that you're inferior. And so it's interesting because, like you said, some people might not register that it's happening, but I wonder what the unconscious effect of microaggressions are.
Might also, maybe I'm making an excuse for myself, might be also be where their intention happens after you make a statement. Because I might like say to someone, because I speak another language, and if I hear the sound, then I like, oh, then I'll say something in your language, or I've traveled to a lot of different countries, and I say, oh, I've been to blah, 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 to make a connection with this person. Because I don't think there's anything wrong in wanting to say, cool, this is great language, or great culture, or great this. So I'm asking in that sense, and it depends what comes next after the statement, like, oh, you're from there, versus, oh, cool, I've been to
That's a very
whatever.
good point. So it doesn't end with the microaggression. Maybe there's I don't know, there's history afterwards, or experience after. And this is an important point about how you really have to take it in context, the whole situation. But often, I mean, life is sometimes so speedy that then you're on to like another issue, and somehow and so you almost forget, quote unquote, about the microaggression because you never really stop to think much about like what occurred and what was your role in it, or could you have acted differently?
I think microaggression happens intentionally and
Right. In case anyone didn't hear, she said microaggressions are intentional and unintentional. So some people it is intentional and some it isn't. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for coming. Please get in touch with either Abigail or myself. We would like to talk more about some of these things. And come to the migration meeting if you're interested on the 11th. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is very interesting. Really.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.